Hello, and welcome to Poetry at the Dalí. I'm Hank Hine, the museum director, and it's my honor to introduce Helen Pruitt Wallace, the curator of this program. Helen Pruitt Wallace is the Poet Laureate of St. Petersburg, and through her connoisseurship and her connections, we've been able to invite marvelous writers to enrich our community with their writing. So tonight is no exception. We have one writer from Washington, D.C., and one from the Tampa area. So thank you for joining us, and thanks to the city of St. Petersburg for its support of this program. Our tradition is to ask Helen Pruitt Wallace to begin with a poem of her own, and I'm hoping that she will grace us with one tonight as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hank, and thanks to all of you for joining us for the Dalí Poetry Series. We have a terrific program for you today, two fabulous poets. We have Elizabeth Lindsey Rogers and Enid Shomer, both especially fitting for National Women's History Month. I'm delighted to have both of you guys here. Thanks for joining us. And I will read one short poem. Before I do, I want to do a shout out to the city of St. Petersburg. Thank you for continuing to support this program. We're going on our, fourth or fifth year. We couldn't do it without your support, and also especially to the museum and to all the terrific staff who work hard to put this program on. We really appreciate it. Okay, I'm going to read one short poem, and this was written for a couple of really strong, wonderful women in my life. It's an older poem, but they have the kind of personalities that just sort of make the world happen. And these particular women wore a hairstyle that just sort of spoke that. They both wore these Beehive hairdos. And this poem is called In Praise of the Beehive. Whether you like the style or not, there's something about the women, a mystery, an allure. What hides beneath that piled minaret? A strange mass crowded with a nest of creatures never before identified. The universe in and of itself, each glistening strand, a wealth of information, a network of charged electric currents, or highways, no rest stops or exits. And who really are these women? Large-hearted, elegant, strong dames with names like Lois and Hazel, bearing up a world with utmost grace, an ecosystem whirling in place, a balanced stratosphere of spiral coif, though none of us, in fact, know what lurks there. I remember as a child reaching high to touch a sprayed turret, wrapped like the sweetest cotton candy. Hair so soft, surely would dissolve as spun sugar melting on the tongue. And how long to forge this odd creation, to plunder, then restore the pyramid, hurled upward towards God, like another great wonder of the world. Thank you. So this evening, we have Elizabeth Lindsey Rogers and Enid Shomer. Here are their books, their most recent books, both fairly recent. And I think probably that's mostly what they're going to be reading from today. And, it's so interesting to me because in reading their poems, they have these odd layers and echoes. Even Enid, the two quotes at the very beginning of your book, they could almost fit right in Elizabeth's book. It's really crazy that the quotes from Melville and Dennis Johnson, it's uncanny how they sort of fit together. So we're going to start with Elizabeth. And I also want to say before I get going, if you don't have their books, I hope you'll go to tombolobooks.com and buy them, because I think both of these are books you're going to want to study. If you are a poet, if you're a writer, you'll be reading them not just for pleasure, although you'll certainly find that there, but also just looking at their forms, the structures of their books. There's a lot to learn in these books. So I hope you'll go to Tombow and order them. Elizabeth Lindsey Rogers is the author of 2 poetry collections, The Tilt Torn Away from the Seasons, Acre Books 2020, a Rumpus Book Club pick, and one of Boston Globe's best books of 2020. And also Chord Box, chosen by Enid Shomer, and published by the University of Arkansas Press in 2013. That book was a finalist for the Lamdba Literary Award, and her poems appear in Poetry, Boston Review, Crazyhorse, Bennington Review, Southern Humanities Review, and elsewhere. Her creative nonfiction has been included in Best American Nonrequired Reading and Best American Travel Writing. A former Kenyon Review Fellow, she currently teaches at American University and lives in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for joining us.
Thanks so much, Helen. And thank you also to Enid for inviting me to read with you. I'm going to be reading from my most recent book today, The Tilt Torn Away from the Seasons. And this is a dystopian book that describes the fallout of climate change. And most of the poems take place on this kind of terraformed version of Mars, where like the mistakes of Western history keep getting rehearsed and replayed. And you know, there's been a lot of Mars stuff in the media recently, but I'm also interested in colonialism and how it's kind of an apocalyptic force. So that's something that I'm always sort of tracing in the poems in this book. I'm going to start with the opening poem of the book. In 2012, NASA released the very first panoramic photographs of the surface of Mars. And the moment that I saw these pictures, I kept thinking about how the surface of Mars resembled the American West, particularly maybe the American West before it was colonized. And so that becomes the kind of metaphoric overlay for the poem. It's called The Frontier, after the first 360-degree panoramic photograph of Mars. And all those years we'd pictured fire, a neon sign blinking vacancy, a world as red as that inside our bodies, but without the claustrophobia, the low ceilings of our skin. We didn't think of a sky azure only at sunset, or stones, a similar blue scattered across the regolith. Now we know this pair of weary moons, the first one painfully slow, a pinprick taking 3 days to move across our vision. The second, Phobos, is the Western origin of fear, misshapen, mold gray. Every 4 hours it rises like the last potato of the famine. And by now I know, as you must, what it means to lose your lakes and oceans, to creak inside the riverbed, cross its sockets and arthritic elbows, to think of rain as a form, a tome of bygone remedies. I can only dream of what snow must do for the desert. The camera pans this world like earth pocked by canyons, like Liberty, the surface looks aged, a green patina. Over dune and dust, the rover's tracks are the only disturbance. Like a sidewinder or wagon ruts, the trail circles and circles itself again. Again, the ground made target practice. We come in peace, curiosity says, but that's how all our ships began. As I land, I weigh next to nothing. I leap 3 times as high, but there is no canopy, no timber for an axe. Apple seeds float. There won't be saplings next year, though spring goes twice as long. Imagine a Western set, a terrain of glare and scour. The unspoken agoraphobia drives us all into the saloon. The sheriff, the unshaven rogue, the virgin in blue gingham, the Indian and the hourglass whore. Horses are dead, whiskey still brown, but a grit in our throats. The first shot sounds. In air this thin, muted as a powder puff. On cue, we turn. Picture how slowly the shutter swings, doors float open. This next poem takes the form of a Q&A, sort of. It's meant to be an application form for people who want to go to Mars. It's called Red Planet Application. When did you first become interested in space? As a baby inside bathwater, soap skidding across the surface, the prisms burst, their remnants taking the form of oil. As a teenager, I lit a match in hydrogen's mouth and listened for the pop. What skills or qualities do you have that may aid the colony? I am naturally calibrated in zeros and ones. I was born with this base 2 ability. I can spot your wedding ring no matter how lost it is in a yard. I also read bass clef. I play the cello. What experiences do you have with cultures other than your own? Despite popular belief, I don't believe China's Great Wall is visible from space. I have shared bunks with many strangers, cotton ceilings shift above me. Any allergies, intolerances to heat, altitude, or cold? In the desert, we call the sky a star rash. We say we can sustain our bodies entirely on rock sugars and rock salts. A family history of cancer or osteoporosis? A river underground, I hear my marrow humming. Have you ever been hospitalized for a psychological condition? Now and then there is a gray day in the canyons, walls know no noise. Sometimes you do sense molecules zinging past your eardrums. You will never see your family or friends again. Discuss. The brush of another person is more gravity than I can stand. Like a lantern's metal and paper, if you touch me, I may collapse. I have sworn off skin to skin, and not just during Lent. Inside a bubble, I prefer to drift at an arm's length. Would you be willing to participate in a 7-year strenuous training program? Someone smashed my rearview mirror. It never meant that much to me. If given 400 feet of wire fencing to enclose a sheep or goat pasture where grass is struggling, choose the shape that best provides the maximum area. Which of the following is most unlike the others? Please retype this message to prove you are not a robot. And which of the following most resembles your self-portrait? You may only choose one. This next series is a sonnet crown. Some of you are probably familiar that in a crown of sonnets, the last line of the sonnet becomes the first line of the one that follows it. And it's sort of about space and how it kind of turns and loops back on itself. Deep space crown. Out the oval, we read darkness. Stars glint like lost sequins or scales numbering a knife's black edge. Libra tips its precarious justice just beyond our reach. This outer world wafts a summer, hot metal, diesel, barbecue. But the moon, matte as wax paper, smells more like gunpowder than egg or bread. We flip through white ink novels typed on endless negative space. Our bodies diminished or augmented, never quite to actual scale. This is how a meter grows into a mile. The mile spins itself into a stone, whooshing out and on and on. Whooshing on and on, our bodies are live cultures trapped in this white capsule. We name ourselves after flora, epiphytes drifting in a realm of cold gas. What we sweat or breathe out will circle eventually back to the drinking glass. Any ship is a hermetic world, an arrow tightened, blunt head swallowing the knock. So forget that blue and cloud earth fading out the porthole. Whatever roots we have will dissolve. Mostly air and dust, we wheel within a wheel. A body sure gets around. Within the ship's sure body, a star wheel replaces the wall calendar. Time squares redrawn with spidery legs, framed in concentric circles. I hear the ratchet click, the only real noise between the world's terrible blanks. Tucked in my hollow spacesuit, I wanted to be a rivet. My head brassy and fixed, the analog in chaos. But every human body is a disaster, the fallout from old stars. My brain is just a tangle of wire, electricity clusters. My hair is recessive rubble, all redshift and helium. Imagine the sun as a red balloon, helium colliding at its core. There, they say, a human's mongrel of atoms will weigh 28 times more. I would never trust the hand of God over gravity's colossal pull. How heavy our limbs grow when faced with that stove eye coming closer and closer. Plasma smells like burning sugar. On Earth, you dream of appliances you forgot to turn off, children you abandoned, and, if you're lucky, the power to fly. In space, you dream only of feet touching down on warm sand or wood. Just sand and warm stone. The universe is a Zen garden or her third cousin once removed. Mechanical arms rake the surface, meditating on grooves and swirls. Occasionally, we hallucinate water inside a gravel's white spill. Like the theater, space can render us stiller than rock. When we do move, it is behind layers, white scrim over cloak over skin. These costumes keep us away from radiation, the hot and cold knobs of other worlds. What I would give now for a beach, the sand white or red or basalt. My feet want a real lip of water, not just a backdrop of blue. Long ago, against a blue water backdrop, we turned and mostly felt nothing. We held ourselves up like trees without wind. Whatever substance our spoon held flowed straight from silver and into our mouths. But now is not then. Now is not even now. Clock hands craving sleep, sloth towards the next white number. To think I once imagined space as the smooth texture of coins or zeros, and never as that deep sap that traps and always keeps. Never as our own atoms, suspended in this colloid. Inside the dark, these stars, we circle and misread. Most regions and major landforms on the planet Mars have already been named by scientists, and a lot of the names recall important areas from Western history or sometimes Western mythology. And there's an area on the surface of Mars called Cumberland, and it made me think about Daniel Boone and sort of the colonial legacy in this country, and what that might mean to replay that over again somewhere else. So this is Cumberland City, Mars. Our origin myth, one silver arm, the robot boring the first hole in rock. What overturned a powder, green as old coins or the Statue of Liberty. Here a woman rose, created in the mountain's image. Ground, when tested, revealed its alkalinity. We commenced a victory garden of turnips and asparagus. It's true, it wasn't enough. So for a half mile, that arm kept digging, hungry for loam or long lost water or honey in the rock, but found old veins, star-crossed minerals, a mouth, a clay world that buried itself alive in hopes it couldn't be claimed. The man, when he landed, renamed every place. This city he named for the gap, for Kentucky Daniel, whose company blazed through some wilderness. Land was a throwaway word, the opposite of water. It meant domain and the right to mine, drill head spinning towards the core of earth. Because he first assumed a clean slate underneath of us, we filled that valley fast with machines' carbon hiss, and our earpieces all droning with the same hunting ballad. Pitches slipped, the lines distorted in the unstable, buffering air. Oh, sound the kill horn, across the face, rocky, rocky. Oh, light out to the Wild West. We need more elbow room. Like the first world, all new names spring from nostalgia. Recall X's on the immigration map and erased trails of salt. There's also a region of Mars known as the Arcadia region. And some of you probably know in the Renaissance, Arcadia was thought of as this kind of utopic wilderness. And of course, there's a really fine line between utopia and dystopia. So that's kind of what this poem is about. Arcadia, Mars. To console myself, I wander wing to wing in the orangery, slip between twisted limbs, olive, silver, and green. The air here whisks so convincingly, I can't believe there's a rock partition keeping me safe from the pinked out sky. In Gethsemane, that ancient other world, they say the Virgin Mary is also buried in a similar grove. They say any rock is agony. They say her grief was deeper than those roots, the oldest known on earth. Our own carbon dates us. If I could cut myself open, you'd see rings lapping more rings. My mother crying for her mother in the same way her mother wept for hers. You'd see the silvery orbit where each life dissolved. But for now, I remain human. I am a nesting doll for griefs. Even in utopia, there is suffering. One sheep forced to walk the labyrinth, ensuring the grass regenerates. And my young daughter, her legs thin as reeds, chased and caught and pushed by the boys again, her layers stripped away. Not even the olive he wedged under her tongue could hold her, clot those cries. These shepherds, they think of nothing but what might wake this weak blue soil. I'm going to read two more poems. There is a crater on the surface of Mars named Columbus. So this poem is about the evils of colonialism and the dangers of the colonial mindset. Columbus, Mars. Just when we agreed we'd overreached, touched that ragged final edge, the next continent began drifting towards us, flow shushing its own pink name. At first, dreamed up, a soap bubble's laminous prism. Then the separate colors clicking into focus, embers shore of ash. Like the old world's tempuras, it darkened the longer we threw our light upon it. Though we still claimed each crater rim what beveled just below the surface. Each had its memory of water, rust like a bathtub's ring. Red sky at night, sailor's delight. We were half drunk when we landed, cruel on our own iron taste. Out of thin air, we became toponymist, touched every place we'd named. Alluring, transfixed, fertile, inclined to love. Who would stop us from drawing this map too in a girl's naked image? Hail the Santa Maria, full of plastic grace. We bottled and vialed minerals, new flora, scrawled our stories on her cabin walls in white ink, a mythic code. Tell the kids, long ago, a fleet of men let their parachutes bloom over desiccated ground. The lost blue pilot felt the wind tear at his face just before his feet touched down, his mind gone blank like sailcloth. I'm going to close with the final poem of the book, and it's kind of a prayer for climate change in a way. It's called Agnus Dei, Mars. Less than a light year ahead, this atmosphere swirls and thickens towards equilibrium. The first conifers pricking the air, dawn a blue yonder, the robin's egg. This world that would not move, this world that once looked plain and red as sealing wax, covers its face with grass, with a noise like breath blown in a bottle. Despite the warnings, I'll step out unhindered by tank or mask, become too winded for words or even listening. I'll wander through white blooms of greasewood, collapse at the mountain's foot. Our drifting, they say, is genetic in nature, a destiny hardwired in ourselves or the stars. But on Earth, as the story goes, my kin cried out for mercy, sheep down to skin and bone. Their planet had grown too warm without passion. Everyone had to make a choice. We live now without animals, don't know how or what to confess. We only know one prayer. Make this soul a clear high note. Make the dust devils weaken. Make my cells repair. Keep me from ultraviolet arrows. Let the air I hold be sweet. Once, in place of the canary, we sent out a trio of women. A 6th lung test, red flues open. The younger two crossed and lived, rushed back to tell the good news. And the old one, we call her a miracle. They say she went out singing. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, Elizabeth. That was a terrific reading, and I'm struck by how cohesive your book is, the way it holds together. I look forward to chatting about that during our Q&A, which will follow after Enid's reading. But so many fine poems, and really a pleasure to hear you read the poems aloud. Speaking of pleasure, we now have the pleasure to hear Enid Shomer. Enid has read for us before at the Dalí Museum, back when we were in the theater, and we certainly hope to be again someday. So, but until then, it's so nice to have you back, even in this format, Enid, especially with your new book. So Enid is the author of 9 books of poetry and prose, most recently Shoreless, which was published in 2020 and won the Lexi Rudnitsky Editor's Choice Award from Persia Books. Her poems and stories have appeared in the New Yorker, the Atlantic, New Criterion, the Paris Review, Poetry, and many other magazines, as well as more than 60 anthologies and textbooks. She received the Lifetime Achievement Award in Writing from the Florida Humanities Council in 2013, and has been the subject of numerous interviews on National Public Radio, their program, All Things Considered, and also Weekend Edition Sunday. She lives in Tampa, Florida, with her husband, the really wonderful painter, Levant Tunzer. Welcome, Enid. So glad you could join us also today. So.
Thank you, Helen. It's a pleasure to be with you again. And I especially want to thank Dr. Hines and all the people at the Dalí Museum and the city of St. Petersburg for supporting so consistently poetry in this area. A few years ago, I lived on Sanibel Island for 2 years, and it's one of many islands off the Florida coast. When you live on an island and can walk on the beach every day for 2 years, you notice a lot of things about wildlife and the beach and the sea that you would never notice otherwise. I'm going to read a couple of poems that came out of that experience. The first poem is called Rara Avis, which is Latin for rare bird. And the bird I'm writing about is Charadrius alexandrinus, which is also known as the snowy plover. Rara avis. What will become of the snowy plover? Only 200 mating pairs remain. Tiny shorebirds, they lay their eggs over a divot of sand at the rack line without cover, reduced by the smallest foot to a yellow stain. What will become of the snowy plover? That little puff of a party favor, the perfect pocket pet if it could be tamed. These tiny shorebirds lay their eggs over the same scrapes in the sand, despite beach lovers spreading their towels unaware and without blame. What will become of the snowy plover? Its legs black straws that blur like wind-up levers, imprinting the shore with a chevron chain. Such tiny birds, they lay their eggs over this beach by instinct, unable to adjust a sliver, not knowing what they risk or what must be reclaimed. Endangered means that I feel the grief the plover can't, as it lays its eggs in the sand over and over. In the same vein, I wrote a poem about the beach called Rara Omnia, which translates as everything is rare, or more colloquially, everything is precious. Rara Omnia. If there's life after death, it isn't the body I'd want, which after all is a rather shoddy container. I'd want to come back as pure voice. I'd want to tell of this beach before the turtles confused the porch lights for moons as they hurtled ashore to lay their eggs. I wouldn't point an accusing finger. I just want the record straight to tell how black skimmers in sinuous hordes turned in the sky like pages of print, how they strained the sea, their lower mandibles seining for fish, that the snowy plovers took flight in waves of applause, their wings beating so fast they seemed to pause, strobe lit. I'd tell how the sea relents in early spring, exposing the muck where creatures spend themselves in extravagant numbers, fighting conchs, hopping like slow rabbits in search of a mate on their singular black feet, Atlantic cockles in spate, their speckled mantles like pink tongues on which they twirl and fall through the inch-deep surf in a ritual dance. And skates, dragging a scarf through the shallows as their wingtips and eye ridges froth the water to tulle, and horse conchs with their glossy orange lips cartwheeling over the sandbar, heroic as salmon swimming upstream. Then the water stood still, limpid, glassed out, afloat with ripe coconuts and mangrove pods, those brown-tipped exclamations, each an infant tree that accretes an island if given a toehold. For weeks, the tides lay like a blanket over the freshly laid eggs, the leathery lays of the lightning whelk, the castanets of conchs with dozens of baby gastropods inside each disk of salty milk. At the end of a month, the water peeled back like bells ringing, and everywhere the egg sacs burst and tiny offspring poured forth. This was before the beach became a catcher's mitt for trash, before the oil spills and red tides, before the hard corals blanched and died, before the fire sponges rotted in their red glory. If I could come back, I'd tell this story and the stories found only in record books, the tarpon reaching 12 feet, the groupers big as cars, cone shells grown heavy as bricks on their packs of poison harpoons, and everywhere the fish, scarce now, mackerel, trout, pompano, drum, so plentiful once they fed us for millennia. I'd send my voice like a whale song into the deep, threading it through turtle grass and sea wrack, singing to the soft corals and sea hares, the polychaete worms and squid. Come back if you can, come back. I'm going to read a poem called Gowned Waiting, which was the sign on a door in a room where I spent a lot of time. I thought it was a very unusual phrase, and poets are always very attuned to unusual language. Gowned Waiting is the name of the room where we sit, clutching rouge pink robes with flimsy ties. One patient flips through fashion mags, her cubicle door ajar. Another rehearses a script, while two friends scheduled together compare injustices at work. I'm writing this in my journal, trying for calm against the terror at hand. This visit, a truce with disease, I negotiate twice a year. A woman enters, speaking broken English, weeping. We understand. Tears are the native idiom here in Gowned Waiting. Minutes ago, she was swept aboard the Diagnosis Express, where everything blurs like a landscape rushing past, though at the moment, her train creeps so slowly that seconds freeze, refusing to pass, trapping her in the instant of discovery, the words that struck like fangs, malignant, invasive, bad. The brochure they gave her, support groups and hotlines, survivors were beribboned in pink, lists on her lap like a shipwrecked paper boat. She wants to run the day backwards, as I did last year, to walk back out through the clinic door to the subway stop, to my block, to pause in reverse for the breakfast I grabbed on the run, until I'm standing wreathed with steam in the morning shower, completely clean. My grandmother had a beauty shop in Miami, and I often visited it, and this poem is a little bit about that. Permanent waves. From memory, that balloon that fills and deflates, comes Grandma Minerva's beauty salon and the flat in back where she lived, a couple of dumpy rooms. Comes Grandma herself, not figure or face or the songs she hummed, but the bouquet of scents that cloaked her as ermine a queen. Underneath them all, she told me, Romanian women had parts like flowers that released a scent especially arousing to men. She covered hers with maha, that perfume with a Spanish dancer swirling a black lace skirt to her thighs, like a matador swinging his cape. But her hands reeked of solutions and dyes. Across the path of her fragrant life, a long line of befores and afters, debutantes, Cuban matrons with mustachioed lips, paged through hairdo magazines, fingered wisps on color charts, a dozen shades of brunette and blonde. She burnished their dusty curls with peroxide, penciled in beauty marks like tiny bullseyes, while facials foamed and pin curls wound down like clocks, in drifted aromas from her kitchen, mamaliga, knishes, brandied pears. She loved her work, stood on her feet for 40 years till the dunes of Miami Beach sprouted a castle, the Hotel Fontainebleau, paved with marble, laced with spiral stairs, It erased the helmet dryers, the manicure trays where fingers splayed like miniature chorus lines. Today, where Grandma lay on a chaise as she wandered the racing form and watched the waves flattening like a bad perm, dangles a 3-story tall chandelier, a hair ornament fit for a hurricane, lashing shoreward with natural curls. The next poem is about having no hair. Actually, I didn't realize that connection until just now. Bald. Cue ball, egg, the handles of tools. Everything wants to be smooth, then smoother. The newel posts worn to satin by generations rushing up and down stairs scooped out, thinned like the bowls of spoons. Even languages slicken. Without the barbarian hordes and given another millennium, Latin, with its prickly cases and moods, would have simplified like Chinese, till every word was good for any part of speech. I own a dog, I dog the dog, I have dog breath, I walk dogly. Oh, the beauties of use, the slow-cooked patina on ivory pistol grips, the rounded corners of leather books, and splendor of splendor's evolution that plucked the vulture's head for dipping in guts unhindered by plumes. I think of my own lost hair like that, not as the cost of killing deadly cells, but a sleek mutation. Bald beneath my Yankee blue, I tip my cap to nature's thrift to cure. The next poem I'm going to read is called The Brain. And as you listen to the poem, you'll figure out whose brain is being discussed. Everything in the poem is factually true. I didn't have to make up anything for this one. The brain. Not the aorta which had burst, or the feet which splayed out, lending a slightly clownish stance. Not the hair, that cloud of silver wishes. What they wanted was the brain. Before the body was cremated, Dr. Thomas Harvey secretly removed it, along with the eyes, a gift to the great man's ophthalmologist. Harvey measured the brain 40 different ways, perfused it with formalin, and took dozens of black and white photos from unusual angles, science noir. He sectioned it into 240 cubes. Wrapped in white gauze, they resembled chunks of Turkish delight. For nearly 50 years, wherever he moved, he took the brain with him, stored in 2 glass apothecary jars, while he waited for science to advance. Because the brain began to fold in on itself when Homo sapiens first evolved, it wasn't surprising that, above all, Harvey noted, this brain looked human. But Einstein had more prefrontal cortical ridges than usual, 4 instead of 3 in each hemisphere, leaving lots of room for speculation. Was this the anatomy of genius? Or were these extra ridges no more significant than the skull bumps phrenologists used to predict character? And what of love? Where was its neuroanatomy? The place where sensory deprivation carves its scars. The brain was slightly smaller than average with more glial cells. And in 2012, when Harvey's photos were released, a knob was found, present in all who study the violin from a young age. When stuck on a physics problem, Einstein played the fiddle. Some say music enabled him to watch gravity bend, space curve, time slow down. If only we could have scanned his prefrontal cortex while he lived, observed the parietal lobes glowing as he pondered space-time or a bunch of carrots for dinner. So far, we know that the brain is an organ that develops out of love, love of another, love of the way light rouges the backlit earlobe or sets the hair aflame, love of the night sky, of the way 2 trains passing each other in a station appear to stand still. I should probably explain that train image is supposedly the way he figured out relativity. He was on a train in a train station and both trains were moving and they appeared to be stationary. And that somehow triggered the whole idea of general relativity. So I've spent a lot of time being Floridian. I've spent a lot of time, at the beach, lots of different islands. This is called on St. George Island. 4 years since I've touched this water or pulled out a fish or lain on my back at the lip of the tidal zone, awaiting the Gulf's crisp white patter, the serious blue ideas that take me far into myself as in love, and then far out as in love. Salt spray like a day-old beard stings and scratches, relaxes into old lace. The surf's attentive to crease and pore, a lover who traded his temper today for extra hands. Like a fountain pen left to leak while a thought coheres, it inks my suit in deltas of lycra, fiber by fiber. It opens the dark fan of my hair, pries me from where the purple-winged coquinas flutter, releasing pearls of air, and floats me on its endless hand until I'm washing back and forth, clear daughter of the tides. When I lived in New York City, one of my favorite places was a piano bar called Bradley's, which unfortunately is no longer there. I think the rent just became too high for the people to maintain the business. I often had sort of synesthesia experiences at Bradley's where I would be listening to music and a lot of other things would sort of meld into those sounds and images. Jazz at Bradley's. Between sets, the brass swan sleeps propped against a wall, long neck drinking in the darkness that must be swallowed to make a song digress from melody until the veins on the player's neck bulge like conduits. The left hand sasses the right on the ivories and the drums race to a stop like long jumpers churning through air. I heard this music once before, canoeing the Swanee, willow leaves dropping like mallets on patches of water bright as the slats of a vibraphone. Beavers gnawing branches down to moats, swirling like the galaxies of secondhand smoke above this bar, whose patrons slump, oblivious with pleasure, as the drummer hoists a harness of sleigh bells and shakes it once. I took a lot of Latin in high school. I just loved it. Most people hated it and dropped out after 2 or 3 years, but I hung in till the end. The Old Empire. In sleep, I open again the heavy transomed door of Latin 5. It's 1961. Miss Virginia Quick, sponsor of the Honor Society, mistress of the Punic Wars, picks me to decline a feminine noun. It's all I can do to keep a straight face above Dave Siegel whispering, "All rise for the genital case." Later, translating Virgil, Miss Quick obscures a line with limb for leg and abdomen for loins. No use. We sniffed the poet's lusty bent in book 4, when to please herself, not the gods, Queen Dido married Aeneas in a cave. The hair of his head stiff as a plaster wreath, a pincushion beard raising roses on her shoulders as he took her from the rear. Miss Quick's empire rested not on the conquest of foreign soil by the cock, augury by entrail, or the scrape of dagger on breastbone. All her mirabile dictus were saved for Roman laws and plumbing, for the aqueduct, which so advanced the cause of hygiene. I picture her now in a marble heaven like our Congress, where petty gods squabble and take sides. There, dressed in the demurest toga of the day, Virginia Quick entertains her suitors, fits them with flamingo wings and dates, brandishing her syntax like a sword as she flirts up a storm in her dead language. Okay, I'm going to read an old poem that I haven't read in a long time. I had the unusual experience of having a poem signed while I was reading it by a professional signer. And it was such a moving experience. I later wrote a poem about that. This is called Reading a Violent Love Poem to the Deaf. I imagine its asters the signer is clenching, their dense centers long vowels, each a boutonniere she plants in our lapels. Delay is what connects me to her, a lag between speech and gesture as formal and stately as velvet festoons. Delay is everything the air burns with, each crook of her finger a diacritical spark. I'm seeing legerdemain, they're seeing American Sign, a language held like an intricate fan before the face, but less deceptive. In the stabbing she mimics, motive comes clear, the signs cascading onto the retina so that her song, drawn on the air, bears its own history, the love before the knife, a wispy skywriting dissolving before our eyes. My own hands, clown-sized saboteurs, betray me with subtext, as if even years after I've written these lines, I might reach again for knives instead of words, when what I want is to leave the literal entirely, my hands ending in 10 feathers, my mouth a simple net. I pin my arms to my sides and watch her word roots shiver into sentences like something shot in time lapse. The handshake, maybe, begun as earnest proof that no weapons would be used, graduating into sculpture, surgery, all the ways we sing. Thank you all.
Wonderful reading. Thank you, Enid, so much. So many terrific poems. And again, I'm loving the kind of overlay that I think I hear between your two books. So we're going to now go into our Q&A time. And I want this to be sort of free-flowing. And let's see. I guess, Rachel, if you don't mind unmuting Elizabeth. Yep.
Yeah,
and also, and Enid too. And then this way we can have just kind of a conversation among all of us. And I will start us out, but I hope that that you all will feel free to ask each other questions as well. So one of the things, of many things that strike me about both of your work is that I'm hearing so much incredible metaphor. Enid, you've heard me say this before. I'm such a fan of your use of metaphor. And Elizabeth, that's also what I loved about many of your poems. You've got so many strong metaphors flowing throughout. I would love to have you both talk a little bit about your use of metaphor in your poems. I'm always curious about the process of writing metaphor. I'm interested in how often those come naturally in your first drafts of poems, how often you have to go back and revise and you notice maybe it's looking a little dry in an area, and so you insert metaphor. If you could talk a little bit about your use of metaphor and how you go about using them in your poems.
Yeah, I'll say that it's a little bit different with each poem, and it's different depending on like what series of poems I'm working on. But for this book, very early, the sort of the metaphor of the surface of Mars appearing like the American West before it was colonized, that emerged very early for me. And that became sort of the central conceit for the book as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, there's that overarching metaphor through the whole book that gives you context and kind of teaches you how to read the book.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also think that with this book, like discovering that so many regions and landforms had been named on Mars already, and those names, came from places in Western culture, Western history. It was just sort of begging, right, for a figurative comparison to take place. So in some ways, I feel that, I feel that the metaphorical groundwork was like already kind of laid out for me, and I just had to kind of find a way to trace it all the way through. I do use a lot of figurative language in my work in general, even if I'm not working on this particular project, and I tend to veer towards sound images more than other mediums. My first book is all about music and sound. As Enid knows, she chose it for the Miller Williams series. So anyway, it really depends on the project, I would say.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. And I do hear that conceit running through this book for sure. And I think that's part of why I said earlier, it just feels so terrifically cohesive. So Enid, how about you? And can you talk a little bit about your use of metaphor?
Right. I tend to be a little less aware of my overarching thematic metaphors, I would say. Probably if I knew them, I wouldn't write some of my books. And when I find them, I'm always very happy to see there's something there, organic and unified. But I believe figurative language is what I really enjoy about poetry, and that's what I really like to address in my poems as well. Often it comes in the first draft, yes, but not always. And if I feel there's a dry patch, as I think you put it, that needs a little more juice, I will go back and just see if there's something there that I want to say. I also use form as a creative crutch, and that helps me find unusual, but still organically unified metaphors, I think. But I read poetry to a large degree for the pleasure of the language. And so I try to offer that in my own work. Right.
Yeah. And actually, the next question I wanted to ask is about form, because you both have some terrific forms in your poems. I mean, you both write a lot of free verse as well. But Enid, you've always been a master of form, and you've got villanelles and sonnets and so many wonderful couplets and throughout your poems. And then also, gosh, Elizabeth, I loved your if I'm not mistaken, you've got two sonnet crowns in your book. I believe, right? You've got the one at the beginning, which is let's see, the one that you read. And don't you have a second one toward the end, like the second to third?
Yeah, there's actually, so there are two kind of sonnet crowns, loose sonnet crowns, and then there's a third one at the end that's like a sonnet crown fugue, where you read across the page as you move on to the next sonnet. So yeah, it's one of the like signature moves in the collection.
Yeah. So my question for both of you is, when you are writing in form, I'm curious about how often you start out with already sort of thinking that you want to settle into some sort of form, even if you allow the poem to go where it goes and kind of follow it into a form. But I'm wondering how often you sort of know from the beginning you want to go there versus being surprised yourself by the form that starts to take over the poem. Can you talk a little bit about that, each of you? Enid, you want to start this time?
Okay, sure. I'm just thinking about your good question. I think the most difficult form, generally speaking, is the villanelle of all the received forms. And I haven't written that many, but I guess I've written 3 or 4, or maybe a little more. And those don't start as villanelles usually, but then once in a while, I've had one I was thinking of reading today, but I really didn't leave time for it. Sometimes the material will suggest the form, but usually for me, I'm a couple of drafts in before I realize, oh, this could be a blank, fill in the blank, sonnet, villanelle, sestina. So it's a kind of mystical process, I think, and it's not completely predictable.
Yeah.
But, as I said, form is a help to me. It's not, a hindrance. I do write in free verse, but even in my free verse poems, I'm always scanning the lines. And
you are, yeah.
Yeah. All that.
There is a sort of formal quality often to your free verse as well. It's a sort of elegance, that's what I would call it. So you tend to find it maybe a couple drafts in and then realize there's some sort of form that's making its way to the top and go there. That's interesting. I think that's
that
probably
one poem that I knew in advance that I wanted it to be a villanelle, and I didn't read it today. I wish I had now, but because the repetition of the words and phrases were so powerful in this particular poem that I knew from the get-go it had to be a villanelle.
Yeah. And how about you, Elizabeth? I know, so yours is your sonnet crowns. They are the sort of smashed or deconstructed sonnets. Can you talk a little bit about that for you? At what point do you realize you've got a sonnet sort of making its way, or do you plan that from the get-go?
I think I look to form for its like constraints and generative possibilities. I really like the sonnet crown as as a kind of assignment to myself, also because it's quite generative, right? And if you get to that last line of the first sonnet, you know where you're going to start with the next one. And I find I have a lot of anxiety about writing, so I find that very helpful, right, to kind of have a place to start. And I also really love the looping quality of a sonnet crown, the way that things keep coming back, and then also the way at the end the whole thing kind of turns over and starts back where it began. I think that's especially if you're writing about outer space, like that seems really kind of fitting. I don't write in strict form all that much. I think in my first book, I know that there's a terza rima, but that was pretty unusual for me to do something like that. I think what I'm more interested in is actually bringing forms from the rest of the world into poetry. Like I have several poems in this collection that take sort of the language of an application form or a standardized test or an exit interview. There's one poem that takes the form of an exit interview. If you've ever left or quit a job, you know what that's like. So I'm interested in repurposing those kind of so-called non-poetic forms for poetry purposes. So that's a thing that I also like to do.
Yeah, and I noticed that because you do that at the very beginning, and I would almost call they almost seem like what might be called a lyric essay in the very beginning, and then again at the end with your exit. I liked how they seem to kind of play off each other structurally, even though it's not at the very end. I think it's 3 poems in from the end or something.
Yeah, it's close. It's close.
Yeah,
it's pretty symmetrical. Like
it is.
Yeah.
It is. And so I'm interested, that does sort of lead into the next question for both of you, because I'm interested in, and it does tie into form, of course, but the structure of your poems, whether you're writing in form or not. I'm interested in the structure on the page and also the structure with respect to how you put your books together. If you don't mind talking a little bit, each of you, about that. One thing I noticed right off the bat, of course, with yours, Elizabeth, is you're writing all the way across the page so often, which lends a sort of buoyancy, a feel of almost sort of floating to the way the words look on the page, which seemed just completely appropriate for your subject matter. And I really loved that. But could you talk about that? And then Enid, if you do likewise, just structure on the page, and how you decide. And again, obviously, sometimes it may be completely tied into a particular form, but often it may not be. And how do you make those choices in your writing process? Elizabeth?
For me, I knew when I started writing these poems, about Mars, that there was going to have to be some way in which the physical form of the poem would honor the strangeness of the landscape, right? That I was looking at. And I thought, I thought about, forms that I'd used before, physical arrangement. And I was like, none of these are going to work. In my first book, you see a couple of poems where I start to get interested in the right margin, and I kind of flip back and forth between the left and right margins. But for the most part, I stay on the left. But for when I started writing these poems, I wanted to find a form that both kind of emulated the idea of the panorama, like the sort of wide open landscape, but also was a little bit disorienting, right? Like the way that you probably would be if you went to another planet. And so I came up with this this form. It's basically like it's tercets that start on the right side of the page and they move left.
Move left,
Right.
yeah, I noticed
Right.
that.
And so it's just ever so slightly disorienting for the reader, but of course they adjust very quickly. But it does have this kind of floating, unmoored sense, and it also uses the entire field of the page, right? And that way, I think it mirrors the landscape that you're looking at. And so there are several poems in the book that are about the actual terra, like right, the sort of landscape and the terrain itself. And a lot of those poems are in this form, right? So it becomes kind of like a signature move in the book that, that I sort of come back to over and over again.
Yeah.
Yeah. In terms of like arranging the whole book, it's really quite a challenge. You have to think about in a subject matter that's this strange, what poem is going to teach readers to read the rest of the book, right? You have to kind of orient them in this world, which requires a lot of sort of suspension of disbelief in a way before you kind of guide them through. So that was a real challenge for me. There are some poems in the book that are kind of flashbacks to like what sort of environmental apocalyptic things on Earth has led to this new situation. And I decided before I published the book to kind of scatter those poems throughout the collection rather than have them in their own section. Because someone suggested to me that's the way memory works. It's not like a contained thing. It's kind of fleeting and associative. And so those backflash or flashback poems, right, are kind of scattered throughout the others, as opposed to being like a contained section in the book. And that decision came to me very, very, very late in the process. But I think it was the right one.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. Enid, how about you? Can you talk a little bit about?
These are such interesting questions, and I don't think anybody's ever asked me about the placement on the page. So I think the orthographic elements, the way it's placed on the page, the font, everything, I think because there's no direct equivalence between, say, the feeling of floating in outer space, for example, in this book, and a way that's already established in orthographic tradition of putting that on the page, you have to make it up. But it is based on a lifetime of reading. When you see something in italics, there are only a few ways you can read that based on how italics have been used for hundreds of years, basically. Usually it's an inner voice or emphatic voice. So there's that. And then in terms of putting a book together, every book has its own challenges. If you're working on I did one book, which is basically a poem biography. So that was pretty easy in that I decided to go with the chronological sequence. Most books of poetry are not that unified thematically. And so you have to look back over the period of time you've been writing the poems in the book and see what your concerns and obsessions were. That's when you become aware of what your themes have been. At least I'm not aware as I'm writing individual poems what my overall concerns and or obsessions are. But those do become more evident when you're putting a book together. And so putting it together is very challenging usually. Yeah. In the case of this book, I asked a couple of people to help me because I just wasn't pleased with the order I had. And that was very helpful to have other people look at it.
Yeah.
So every book is different.
Yeah. And did you find, Enid, that that you were shifting then the order of the poems at various points, kind of like Elizabeth said, when she realized that memory is often done in flashbacks and it does move around? Same thing, yeah.
Yes. I had a lot of poems about illness in this book, and originally I had them all together, and that was just oppressive for the reader. So I decided not to put them together.
Yeah.
That I think was very helpful because it was really sort of too much at one go. And I think, as Elizabeth said, if you're recalling something, memory is like that. It's all over the place. It's not consistent either. So you might have one version of an experience and then later in the book another version of the same experience. And those enrich each other, but when they're next to each other, it's often not enriching so much as competing.
Right. Right.
That's what I discovered with this book. That,
Mhm.
that
Well, and it
it's
strikes me
certain way.
too. It strikes me too that you also, in doing that and spreading them out, you include so many other things. That the body as sort of landscape ties into then your focus on environmental issues and the ecology and birds and nature. So I think you handle that so well in choosing to spread them out. It kind of, for me anyway, it broadens the whole nature of what you're trying to talk about.
Right, I think you're right. And a lot of people have mentioned that the body is a sort of landscape in this
Right.
book. And I guess even though I know that, I didn't consciously know it until I was putting it together. And
Yeah.
I saw that, I sort of view the floral landscape as an extension of my body, really.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah.
Are there questions that you all would like to ask each other about your work?
I have a question for Elizabeth. What are you working on now, Elizabeth?
Whew. Well, a couple of things. So I have an essay collection actually that is almost done, I think. So I'm sort of tying the loose ends up in that. And then the poems are sort of moving in two different directions. There's one set of poems that is kind of, it's related to climate change, but it's very much like set in our time and place. And those are kind of like large scale place poems, site specific poems. And then there's another vein that seems quite separate, which is about the experience of becoming a parent, and also the kind of bizarre scientific way in which that happened. My wife and I have a child that she carried and that was created from my egg. So it's a pretty amazing. Thank you. Well, it's a very amazing kind of scientific thing that we did, and sort of the pleasure and also the responsibility that has come with parenting. I mean, it kind of really changes your life and makes you ask questions about what's important. So so some of the poems are in that vein, exploring those subjects from a couple of different angles. Pandemic has not been good for my writing process, and I don't really have any time right now. But I've got those projects on the back burner.
Yeah. How about you, Enid?
Well, I'm working on some essays that are kind of a memoir in essays. That's what I'm working on right now. And I'm writing new poems. I never sort of have a view in ahead of time. I'm always a little surprised at what I'm with. But I am trying to shape these essays into a coherent memoir.
I could totally relate to that, Enid. I think even in a book that is sort of very thematically focused, I think we're kind of not aware of that kind of stuff until much later in the process. I find that to be true for myself as well. It takes a long time.
That's reassuring to hear. It's really kind of a freakish experience not to know what you're working on at the deepest level.
But also sort of fun, right? That means there's discovery in it. And,
also terror until maybe, for me, it's not until almost somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the way through that it becomes clear. Oh, like here's a shape that is emerging. It's very late.
Very late. It's very late for me too. And I really think I wouldn't write these books if I knew it ahead of time. I have everything resolved and ordered and sorted in my mind. I wouldn't need to write the books.
Interesting. Well, I also really like the fact that I think now more than ever, we as writers have the option to blur. I love playing around with that, and I think it's so closely aligned to poetry. I mean, again, if I had seen those of yours, Elizabeth, if I'd seen them in a book of essays, I would have completely assumed they were just lyric essays. I would not have necessarily thought they're. So, I think that's kind of fun. I like the fact that that's opened up, and hybrids are not only allowed, but I think they're celebrated. So
it's funny. book of prose that I have, the essays are quite traditional essays.
Oh.
They don't, they use rhetoric and narrative, right? And traditionally, I haven't liked my projects to touch at all. Like there's the poetry and then there's the prose side, and there's not a lot of overlap. But then recently, since the pandemic, I have been noticing the kind of compulsion to write a lyric essay. So something's happening in this new
Mhm.
kind of culture that we're a part of. I had a question for Enid, if we have time.
Yes, please. Yeah.
You mentioned something about how you thought of the Florida landscape as an extension of your own body. And I also noticed, as you pointed out as well, that there's a lot of poems in this book about disease, and kind of mortality is like
Mhm.
around the edge of that.
Mhm.
Is there anything about the Florida landscape that's connected to the idea of disease and mortality? I'm just thinking about like you literally being on the edge of the country, surrounded by water.
Oh, yeah.
Is there something there?
Not that I'm aware of, but I can
Good
see that that would be a nice thing to be able to say.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. No, I'm just thinking about it now. No, I guess I think of the landscape as more eternal than that, although certainly I've written about endangered animals that are just heartbreaking, little plovers. I don't think we're going to have them much longer. So maybe it's inherent in our situation today with climate change and the mass extinction that we're in the middle of.
Yeah.
But again, it was unconscious if it was there.
Sure.
But I'll take it.
Yeah. Well, it has been such a delight to have both of you join us for the Dalí Poetry Series. Thank you so much. And I really look forward to seeing what both of you come up with next. And Elizabeth, so nice to meet you and to see you again, Enid. And thanks to all of you all for tuning in. And I hope that you can join us next month also for the Dalí Poetry Series. Bye. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.